Hey there, and welcome to Dark Creaky TV. If you're new, hit that subscribe button for spine-tingling Reddit creepypasta stories that are perfect for a night of chilling thrills. Don't forget to share your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and let's get into tonight's stories. The Ouija board told me I wasn't alive. Now I'm starting to believe it. This whole thing started about a month ago, on one of those nights where everything feels a little too quiet, like the world's holding its breath. My friends, Mark and Jess, had come over to my apartment for a chill night in. Jess brought over a dusty old Ouija board she found at some thrift store, and she swore it was for fun. I wasn't exactly into that kind of thing, spooky games or whatever, but it was just us, a few beers, and the promise of a good laugh. I figured, why not? So we cleared the coffee table, dimmed the lights for effect, Jess's idea, and placed the board in the middle. Honestly, it looked as worn out as you'd expect. The letters faded, the wood scuffed from years of use. Jess was totally into it, telling us to put our fingers on the planchette with focus, or else it won't work. Mark rolled his eyes but played along, half chuckling as he muttered something about all this spooky nonsense. We started asking harmless questions at first. Is anyone here with us? The planchette moved, slowly at first, then picked up speed as it slid over to yes. We all laughed, assuming Jess was pushing it to mess with us, but she swore up and down it wasn't her. And yeah, it felt like someone else was moving it, but at the same time, not. It's hard to explain, but I could feel the hairs on my arms stand up. It was subtle, but something felt off. Mark leaned in, jokingly asking, "What's your name?" The planchette spelled out something weird, a jumble of letters that didn't make any sense. We brushed it off as the board warming up and kept going, throwing out random questions to see what it would say. But every response was stranger than the last. Random letters, numbers, sometimes spelling things backwards. It was like the board wasn't trying to communicate, just scatter its message across the room. Finally, Jess, clearly spooked, but trying to laugh it off, asked, "How old are you?" The planchette hovered over 2 to 4, then slid to DEAD. We all sat there, dead silent, staring at each other. A joke's a joke, but that was downright creepy. But it was what happened next that's been haunting me ever since. Mark, trying to break the tension, smirked and said, "All right, spooky board. What about my name? Are they going to be okay?" Jess shot him a glare, telling him not to joke about stuff like that. But before she could finish, the planchette started moving on its own. And this time, it wasn't some random jumble of letters. It spelled out, clear as day, NOT, ALIVE. We all froze, staring at each other, half convinced one of us was messing with the others. But I swear, in that moment, none of us were moving that thing. It glided with purpose, every letter deliberate, as if someone was there, spelling it out for me. Jess laughed nervously, like maybe it was some kind of prank, but the mood was shot. We all pulled our hands back, suddenly not in the mood to play anymore. Mark tried to laugh it off, saying Ouija boards just spell out random things, but he didn't look like he believed it either. Something about the whole experience left us shaken. They left shortly after, but that message, "not alive," was burned into my mind. I told myself it was nothing, just a creepy coincidence, and went to bed. But even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was missing something, like there was something just outside my mind's reach, waiting for me to notice it. When I finally fell asleep, I dreamed of the board. Only this time, it wasn't in my apartment. I was sitting in a pitch-dark room, the board glowing faintly in the middle of a table. I couldn't see who was sitting across from me, but I could feel their presence, heavy and dark, like a shadow stretching over the whole room. My hand was on the planchette, but I couldn't pull it away. My fingers felt glued to it, like something was holding me there. The planchette began to move, slowly at first, then faster, spelling out the same phrase over and over. Not alive. Not alive. Not alive. I woke up drenched in sweat, my heart racing, the phrase echoing in my mind. I looked over at the clock, 3:33 a.m. figures. The whole thing freaked me out so much that I threw the board out the next morning. I didn't even call Jess or Mark about it. Just dumped it in the trash and tried to move on with my life. I told myself it was just a game, that the whole not alive message was some sick coincidence, a random series of letters that meant nothing. But the weird part is, after that night, things started to change. At first, it was little stuff. I'd wake up feeling exhausted, like I hadn't slept at all, my muscles stiff and heavy. My reflection in the mirror looked wrong. My skin was pale, almost grey, and my eyes had this dull, glassy look, like I wasn't really looking at myself. I figured I was just tired, maybe coming down with something, but it felt deeper than that, like something was wearing me down from the inside. People around me started noticing too. My co-workers would make comments, asking if I was okay, saying I looked different. Jess even texted me a couple of times, asking if I'd seen a doctor. I kept telling her I was fine, but honestly, I didn't feel fine. I felt hollow, like something essential had been taken from me, and I was just going through the motions. But the worst part, the part that's really starting to mess with my head, is the memories. Lately, I've been having these strange flashes, moments that feel familiar but wrong, like I'm seeing them from someone else's perspective. I'll be in the middle of doing something normal, like washing dishes or walking down the street, and suddenly I'll remember something that doesn't make any sense. I'll see myself, lying still and silent, as if watching from above. Or I'll remember walking down a street I've never been to, my feet sinking into the ground as if I was walking through sand. At first, I thought maybe I was just stressed, that all of this was some weird reaction to lack of sleep. But now, every time I close my eyes, I see it again. The message, spelled out in those fading letters, not alive. And part of me, deep down, is starting to believe it. The days that followed weren't normal. Something about reality itself felt off. I kept telling myself it was just leftover paranoia from the Ouija board, but this feeling, it was sinking into everything, like the world around me was fading out of focus. The first real shift happened when I was at work, just sitting at my desk, typing up some reports. I looked down for a second, maybe just a blink, and when I looked back up, I was standing in the middle of the hallway. No memory of getting up, no reason for being there, just suddenly standing, a whole aisle away from my desk, with my co-workers staring at me like I'd lost it. One of them, Alice, chuckled nervously and asked if I was sleepwalking. I laughed it off too, tried to joke about it, but inside, I was shaken. I'd never done anything like that before, never had gaps like that. When I finally sat back down, my hands were trembling, and that sense of wrong was stronger than ever. My desk looked exactly as I'd left it, but for some reason, everything felt unfamiliar, like I was looking at someone else's belongings. The monitor, the coffee mug, even the papers scattered across my desk. All of it seemed to belong to someone I'd never met. The feeling passed, but it left me with this unsettling sensation, like I'd just stepped back into myself after being somewhere else entirely. Later that night, I figured I'd try calling Mark and Jess, see if they'd experienced anything weird since the Ouija board night. Jess picked up after a few rings, sounding tired, and I could tell she wasn't eager to talk about it. She brushed it off as just a stupid game, and said she hadn't noticed anything strange since then. She laughed it off, but there was an edge to her voice, like she didn't want to admit she was spooked too. Mark, on the other hand, didn't answer, and my text to him went unread for hours. After a while, I started pacing around my apartment, feeling this strange tension I couldn't shake. And then it happened again, a split second where I blinked or thought I did, and I was somewhere else. This time, I was outside. I felt a sudden chill, and when I looked around, I realized I was standing in the middle of the street. a few blocks away from my building. The street was empty, silent, except for a faint breeze that rustled through the trees. It was like the whole world had just stopped, holding its breath around me. I checked my phone, and that's when my heart dropped. The last time I looked, it was barely 9 o'clock. But now, the screen showed 1:37 a.m. 4 hours had just disappeared, swallowed up in a blink. I had no memory of walking there, no idea what I'd been doing in that time. The worst part? As I stared at my phone, I noticed my hands. They looked pale, almost translucent, like they'd been drained of colour. My veins stood out starkly against my skin, and my fingers were icy cold. The phrase from the board came rushing back, as if it had been waiting in the shadows of my mind. Not alive. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen in place, before I finally forced myself to move. I stumbled back to my apartment, locking the door behind me, my mind racing with questions I didn't want to answer. I went straight to the bathroom, flipping on the lights and staring into the mirror, hoping, praying that I'd look normal, that I was just seeing things. But my reflection looked wrong, distorted somehow, like I was looking at a photograph that had been warped in a slow, subtle way. My skin was paler than I remembered, my eyes darker, almost sunken, like I hadn't slept in days. And then, as I stared, something even worse happened. For a split second, my reflection blinked, but I didn't. It was the briefest of moments, a fraction of a second, but I saw it. My reflection blinked on its own, like it was looking back at me. I stumbled back, gripping the sink, trying to convince myself it was just exhaustion, just my mind playing tricks. But I could feel it, the same way you feel someone's eyes on you in a crowded room. That reflection, that other version of me, was watching. After that, I stopped looking in the mirror. I couldn't handle it, couldn't shake the feeling that if I stared too long, that other me might start to move on its own. The next day, I didn't go to work. I called in sick, my voice shaky, as I mumbled something about not feeling well. I spent most of the day in bed, hoping that maybe a little sleep would fix whatever was going on. But every time I closed my eyes, I'd see those strange, distorted images. Flashes of myself lying in dark, unfamiliar places, eyes wide open, staring into nothing. I tried to distract myself, to do anything but sleep. I put on the TV, flipped through my phone, trying to ground myself in the familiar. But the shifts kept happening. Every time I closed my eyes, even for a second, I'd find myself somewhere else. A dark alleyway, a crowded street at night. Places I'd never been, but that felt weirdly familiar, like I'd been there once in a dream. The strangest part was the people. In every shift, I'd see people, strangers, staring at me, their faces blank and expressionless. They'd just stand there, watching, like they were waiting for me to do something. But as soon as I focused on them, they'd disappear, fading into the shadows like they'd never been there. That night, I tried to reach Mark again, hoping he might have some kind of answer. His phone went straight to voicemail, so I texted him, practically begging him to call me back. But as I hit send, a chilling thought crossed my mind. What if Mark wasn't getting my messages? What if the real Mark wasn't even there anymore? Just as that thought crossed my mind, my phone buzzed. A new message from an unknown number. "You're almost there." I stared at the screen, dread creeping over me. I didn't know who'd sent it or what it meant, but something about it felt final, like I was on the edge of something I couldn't come back from. And somehow, deep down, I knew that whatever was happening, whatever shifts I was experiencing, they weren't just random flashes. They were leading me somewhere, drawing me into a place that wasn't my own. And if I kept following, I might never find my way back. After that message, I didn't sleep for 2 days. I kept expecting my phone to buzz again, waiting for another cryptic text from some unknown number, but it never came. Instead, everything around me started to feel more fragile, like I was walking through a version of my life that could break at any second. I decided to get out of my apartment for a bit, hoping some fresh air would snap me back to reality. I walked through my neighborhood, which should have felt comforting, but everything seemed slightly out of place. The sky looked too grey, the streets too quiet, like I'd wandered into a hollow replica of my own world. Even the people I passed looked wrong, their faces blank and expressionless, like those strange figures I'd seen in the shifts. And then I started noticing them. The signs, little things that made my stomach twist in ways I couldn't explain. It started when I glanced down at my hand and saw a faint mark on my wrist, a symbol, almost like a brand, that I definitely hadn't noticed before. It was faint, barely visible, but it looked like an infinity sign with jagged lines through it, something that felt ancient and wrong. My first instinct was to rub it off, thinking maybe it was just a smudge or bruise, but it wouldn't fade. The harder I scrubbed, the more it burned, until the pain forced me to stop. I stared at the mark, my mind racing with questions I didn't want to answer. I started seeing the symbol everywhere. Graffiti on the sides of buildings, scratched into sidewalks, even carved into the wood of park benches. It was like some invisible hand had left it there for me, following me through the city, a reminder that I couldn't escape. Each time I saw it, that same eerie chill ran down my spine, like I was being watched. The next day, I went to grab my morning coffee at a cafe near my apartment, hoping a little caffeine would clear my head. But as I walked in, I noticed a group of people seated at a corner table, all staring at me, their eyes wide and unblinking. They weren't saying anything, just watching, their faces blank and familiar, like I'd seen them before. I tried to ignore it, told myself I was just being paranoid, but when I glanced back, they were still staring, their heads tilted slightly, their eyes following my every movement. I forced myself to turn away, my heart pounding, and focused on ordering my coffee. But as I waited, I could feel their gaze burning into me, and I knew, deep down, they weren't just random people. They were part of whatever was happening, whatever I'd let in that night with the Ouija board. When I finally got my coffee, I practically ran out of the cafe, barely daring to glance back. But as I passed a window, I caught a reflection of myself, and what I saw made my blood run cold. My own reflection was staring back, but it wasn't me. Not exactly. My eyes were darker, almost black, and my expression was blank, emotionless, like those strangers in the cafe. I blinked, and for a split second, I saw myself smile, a slow, eerie grin that didn't belong to me. I stumbled back, heart racing, and the reflection returned to normal, leaving me standing there, shaking and confused. I needed answers. I needed to know what was happening, why I kept seeing these signs, these twisted symbols that seemed to be marking my way. I found myself pacing the city, retracing every step, searching for anything that might give me a clue. And then, like it was waiting for me, I saw it. A small, hole-in-the-wall shop I'd never noticed before, with a faded sign that read, "Spiritual readings and cleansings." I didn't believe in that kind of thing, but I was desperate. I pushed open the door, and a small bell jingled as I stepped inside. The place was dimly lit, filled with shelves of old, dusty books and strange trinkets that seemed to pulse faintly in the low light. Behind the counter was an older woman, her face lined and weathered, but her eyes sharp and knowing. She didn't say a word, just motioned for me to sit down. I hesitated, feeling a strange pull toward her, like she knew exactly why I was there. I sat, clutching my hands together to hide the mark on my wrist, but she noticed anyway. Her eyes narrowed, and she leaned forward, inspecting the symbol without touching it. "You've seen them," she whispered, her voice low and steady. "The ones from the other side. They're marking you, preparing you." "Preparing me?" I managed to ask, my voice barely a whisper. "For what?" She looked at me with a mix of pity and fear, like she'd seen people like me before, people who'd crossed into something they didn't understand. "There are doors that shouldn't be opened," she said, her voice grave. "When you called them, you offered yourself up. You let them see you." I tried to argue, to tell her it was just a game, that I didn't believe in any of this. But the look in her eyes silenced me. She knew what she was talking about, and I could feel it in the pit of my stomach, the truth of her words settling into my bones. "You need to sever the connection," she continued, her gaze locked onto mine, "before it's too late. Once they've marked you, once they know who you are, it's almost impossible to escape." She handed me a small worn amulet, etched with symbols that looked even older than the ones I'd been seeing. "This will help," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But you mustn't look at your reflection tonight. Don't let them see you watching." I left the shop, clutching the amulet so hard it dug into my palm. The old woman's words echoed in my mind, filling me with a dread that felt like it would never go away. That night, I followed her instructions. I avoided every mirror, every reflective surface, doing my best to pretend that I was alone, that nothing was watching. But even as I lay in bed, the sense of being watched was stronger than ever, as if there were eyes hidden in every shadow, waiting for me to slip up. And then, just as I was about to fall asleep, I heard it. A whisper, faint but clear, right next to my ear. "We're almost here." My heart hammered in my chest, but I didn't dare move. I just lay there, clutching the amulet, feeling that faint pulse beneath my skin, the mark on my wrist burning like a brand. And in the darkness, I knew that whatever I'd let in, it wasn't going to stop until it had me. I barely slept after that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt them creeping closer, waiting for me to drift off, their whispers brushing against my ears, like they were calling me into some dark place I didn't want to go. The amulet from the woman at the shop helped a little. I could feel it pulse faintly against my skin, like it was holding back whatever lurked just beyond the edge of reality. But I knew it wasn't enough. The mark on my wrist had grown darker, almost like it was carved into my skin. The shape seemed to shift whenever I looked at it, twisting and curling like it was alive. And every time I touched it, I felt a strange, icy sensation shoot up my arm, numbing everything it touched. I tried to stay busy, to ignore it all, but the signs were impossible to escape. Everywhere I went, I saw people with that same blank stare, strangers watching me with eyes that felt too familiar, like they knew exactly who I was, what I'd done. I'd catch glimpses of them out of the corner of my eye, standing just outside the edges of my vision, disappearing as soon as I turned to look. One evening, out of sheer desperation, I decided to visit Mark. He hadn't answered any of my calls or messages, and a part of me hoped that maybe he was going through the same thing, that he'd know what to do. His apartment was only a few blocks away, but the walk felt endless, every street seeming longer and darker than it should have. By the time I reached his building, my nerves were frayed, the feeling of being followed stronger than ever. When I knocked on his door, there was no answer. I knocked again, louder, but all I got was silence. Just as I was about to give up, the door creaked open on its own, and I felt a chill run down my spine. Inside, the apartment was dark, too quiet, like the air itself was holding its breath. I called out for him, my voice barely above a whisper, but there was no response. I stepped inside, the shadows seeming to press in around me, thick and suffocating. The place was a mess, papers and clothes scattered everywhere, like he'd left in a hurry. As I moved further in, something caught my eye, a note crumpled on the coffee table, covered in frantic scribbled handwriting. I picked it up, my hands shaking, and read the words scrawled across the paper. "Don't look in the mirrors, they're watching. The mark is a door, and once it's open..." The rest was smudged, unreadable, but I didn't need to see the rest to know what he was talking about. The dread settled deeper in my chest. a weight that felt like it was crushing me from the inside. I left the note on the table, backing away, and that's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. On the wall across from me, barely visible in the dim light, was the same symbol that was on my wrist. It was scratched into the paint, faint but unmistakable, like it had been burned into the wall. I stumbled back, heart racing, and that's when I heard it, a faint, shuffling sound coming from the hallway. I turned, my pulse pounding, and saw a figure standing just at the edge of the shadows, watching me. It was Mark, but he looked wrong. His skin was pale, almost translucent, his eyes sunken and hollow. He didn't move, just stood there, staring, his mouth twisted into a faint, unnatural smile. "Mark?" I managed to whisper, my voice shaking. He didn't respond, just tilted his head slightly, like he was studying me. And then, in a voice that didn't sound like his at all, he whispered, "They're coming for you." I backed away, my heart hammering, and he stepped forward, his movements slow and jerky, like he was being pulled by invisible strings. His eyes were blank, empty, like there was nothing human left inside him. Panicking, I turned and bolted for the door, not daring to look back. I raced down the stairs, feeling his presence behind me, like he was following me even though I couldn't hear his footsteps. When I burst out onto the street, I didn't stop, just kept running, the cold night air stinging my face, my lungs burning as I pushed myself faster. Finally, I reached my apartment, slamming the door behind me, gasping for breath. But the relief didn't last long. The shadows in my apartment seemed to shift, growing darker, stretching across the walls like they were alive, like they were waiting for me to let my guard down. The amulet around my neck pulsed again, the faint glow barely visible, but I could feel its energy weakening, like it was struggling to keep whatever was outside at bay. I clutched it tightly, hoping it would hold, but a voice whispered from the darkness, low and mocking, "You can't hide from us." I froze, the voice sending a chill through my body, and I knew that whoever, or whatever, was speaking, it was one of them, the ones from the other side, the ones I'd let in. I backed away, feeling my way to the bedroom, locking the door behind me, as if that would somehow keep them out. But the whispers continued, seeping through the walls, growing louder with every second. I could hear their words now, fragments of phrases that filled my mind with images I didn't want to see. "The mark is the doorway. You're one of us now. Let us in." I squeezed my eyes shut, clutching the amulet so tightly it cut into my palm, the pain grounding me, keeping me anchored in the only reality I had left. But deep down, I knew it was a losing battle. The mark on my wrist burned like fire, the symbol glowing faintly in the dark, pulsing in time with the whispers. And then, just as suddenly as they had started, the voices stopped. The silence that followed was even worse, thick and heavy, pressing down on me from all sides. I opened my eyes, my heart pounding, and stared at the door, waiting for something, anything, to happen. After a few minutes, I let out a shaky breath, convincing myself that maybe it was over, that they'd finally given up. But as I glanced down at my wrist, I realized the mark had changed again, the lines twisting and curling into a new shape, something that looked eerily like an eye. And in that moment, I understood. They weren't just marking me, they were watching me, using the symbol as a window, a way to see into my world. I backed away from the door, clutching the amulet, feeling the weight of their gaze on me, heavy and suffocating. And I knew, without a doubt, that this was only the beginning. I barely slept that night. Every shadow, every faint creak of the floorboards sent jolts of fear through me. I sat on my bed, clutching the amulet, watching the mark on my wrist with a growing sense of dread. The symbol had twisted into that eye, and now it seemed alive, pulsing like it was aware of me. Whatever was on the other side wasn't just watching, it was waiting. The next day, I decided I couldn't just sit around, waiting for them to come. I had to do something. I went back to the shop, the one where the old woman had given me the amulet. I pushed open the door, desperate for answers, but the place was empty, the lights off, the shelves bare. There was no sign of her, no hint that anyone had ever been there at all. I was alone. Defeated, I wandered the streets, feeling their eyes on me, lurking in every shadow. I kept seeing that symbol everywhere, scratched into concrete walls, scrawled on scraps of paper, even carved into the bark of trees. It was like a trail leading me somewhere. And though every instinct screamed for me to turn back, I couldn't. Something beyond my control was pulling me forward, guiding me. As night fell, I found myself back at my apartment building, standing at the entrance. The door was cracked open, dark and silent, as if waiting for me to step inside. I took a deep breath, clutching the amulet tighter, and walked in. The hallway was empty, quieter than usual, like the entire building had been abandoned. I made my way up the stairs, every step echoing in the silence, my heartbeat pounding louder with each step. When I reached my floor, I stopped, staring down the dark hallway toward my apartment. And there, waiting by my door, was a figure. It was Mark, or at least something that looked like him. He stood perfectly still, his face pale, his eyes dull and empty. That faint, unnatural smile twisted across his face, the same smile I'd seen in the cafe, the one that didn't belong to him. "Mark," I called out, my voice barely a whisper. He didn't answer. He just lifted his hand, pointing to my door, his smile widening. It was an invitation, one I didn't want to accept, but I knew I had no choice. My hand trembled as I reached for the doorknob, feeling an icy chill seep through my skin as I turned it. Inside, the apartment was dark, only a faint glow coming from the living room. I stepped inside, my footsteps muffled on the carpet, and as I moved closer, I saw it. The Ouija board. It was lying in the middle of the floor, the planchette resting in the center, as if it had been waiting for me all along. I didn't want to go near it, didn't want to touch it, but my legs moved on their own, carrying me forward until I was standing over it. The room felt cold, the air thick and heavy, pressing down on me. I reached out, my fingers hovering over the planchette, and the moment I touched it, the board came to life. The planchette moved, slowly at first, then faster, spelling out a single word: welcome. The shadows around me deepened, swirling like smoke, and I could feel them. Hundreds of eyes, all watching, waiting, drawn to me by that cursed mark on my wrist. The voices started again, a low murmur that grew louder, filling my mind, pulling me down into something dark and endless. I tried to pull my hand away, but it was like the planchette had fused to my skin, dragging me deeper into whatever lay on the other side. The voices were clearer now, each one whispering my name, calling me to join them. "We've been waiting for you." The room started to shift, the walls twisting, stretching, as if reality itself was coming undone. I looked around, heart pounding, and realized I was no longer in my apartment. The walls had faded, replaced by shadows that seemed to pulse, alive with dark, formless shapes that watched me with eyes that glowed faintly in the darkness. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My voice was gone, swallowed by the darkness, and I could feel them surrounding me, drawing closer, their whispers growing louder, more insistent. "You opened the door," one of them hissed, its voice soft and mocking. "You invited us in." I stumbled back, my hands trembling, and looked down at my wrist. The mark had spread, twisting up my arm, curling around my skin like a chain. The eye was open now, staring back at me, unblinking, like it was part of me, like it had always been there. And in that moment, I understood. I was the door. I had let them in, and now there was no way to close it. They moved closer, their shapes shifting, surrounding me, filling every inch of the darkness. I could feel them pressing against me, merging with me, their cold, empty presence seeping into my skin. I tried to fight, to pull away, but it was useless. They were inside me, twisting through my mind, taking over. As the last of my will faded, I felt a strange sense of peace, a hollow, numb acceptance. I could hear them now, clearly, their voices echoing in my mind, a constant, comforting hum. "You're one of us now," they whispered, and I could feel myself slipping, my thoughts fading, replaced by their endless cold presence. The last thing I saw was my reflection in the darkness, my own face, smiling back at me, my eyes empty, lifeless. And then there was nothing. We played with a Ouija board at a friend's house. Now, none of us can leave. I'm not one for ghost stories or horror movies. I don't scare easily, and if I'm being honest, I used to think Ouija boards were just some silly game people played at sleepovers to freak each other out. But that was before last weekend, before everything changed. It all started when my buddy Josh invited a group of us over for a late-night hangout at his place. It was supposed to be a typical chill night. Order some pizza, play video games, maybe crack open a few beers. Josh had just moved into a new house he was renting with some friends, and this place had vibes, if you know what I mean. It was this old, creaky, two-story house that looked like it had a history. The kind of place that still had a servant's stairwell and one of those creepy attics where the floorboards were warped and always felt slightly damp. So, there we were, chilling in his dimly lit living room, just messing around. Josh's housemate, Emily, got bored and dug out this old Ouija board she'd found in a closet. It was one of those old wooden ones with fading letters and a worn planchette. She claimed it had been left behind by the previous renters, along with some dusty books and a locked trunk. Honestly, I thought it was just some kitschy piece of decor. Emily was all in on the idea, though. "Come on, it's just a game," she said, grinning like a kid. She placed the board on the coffee table, and with a couple of laughs and eye rolls, 4 of us, me, Josh, Emily, and our friend Sarah, sat down around it. We decided to kill some time and have a laugh. What was the harm, right? Josh dimmed the lights even more, partly for ambiance, and partly because they were already half busted anyway. We sat cross-legged around the board, and Emily insisted we each place 2 fingers on the planchette. Josh smirked and whispered, "Spirits, are you there?" in this dramatic voice, clearly not taking it seriously. None of us were, at least not yet. We started asking the usual dumb questions. "Is anyone here with us? What's your name?" Each time the planchette stayed still, and we'd laugh and make jokes. I was about ready to call it quits when Sarah decided to take things up a notch. "Who are you?" she asked in a low, serious tone, almost daring the board to respond. That's when the planchette jerked under our fingers, sliding toward YES in this slow, deliberate movement. We all stared at each other, and I swear no one was pushing it. It was this heavy, unsteady feeling, like trying to hold on to something that didn't want to stay. Josh laughed nervously, glancing around the room. "All right, which one of you did that?" But none of us said a word. We were all just staring at the board, waiting. The silence in the room felt dense, almost like the air had thickened around us. Emily, who was usually the skeptic in the group, looked a bit pale. "Okay, seriously," she said. "If there's someone here, what do you want?" The planchette trembled again, moving slowly, painfully slowly, as if something was guiding it, letter by letter. LEAVE. It was almost funny, like some ghost just wanted us to get out. But the way it moved, the deliberate slowness of it, made my skin prickle. We laughed it off, nervously, not really sure what to think. Fine, Josh said, rolling his eyes. "Let's be done with this." He started to lift his fingers, but Sarah stopped him. "You're supposed to say goodbye," she whispered, her voice barely audible. I didn't know much about Ouija boards, but I'd heard that you were supposed to end the session by moving the planchette to goodbye. Emily nodded, but when we tried to move it, the planchette wouldn't budge. It felt stuck, like something was pressing back against our hands, holding it down. And then, without warning, it started moving again on its own. We watched, wide-eyed, as it spelled out one word: S-T-A-Y. We sat there, frozen, just staring at the board. The room felt different, colder somehow. Emily tried to laugh, but it came out strained, her voice shaky. "All right, joke's over. Let's put this thing away." But no one moved. I don't know what it was. Maybe just the tension in the room, or maybe something deeper. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, that we'd done something we couldn't undo. We finally managed to push the planchette to goodbye, though it took more effort than I'd expected. It was like trying to push through something thick and invisible. As soon as we did, the planchette stopped, dead still. We all breathed a sigh of relief, nervously laughing it off. It felt silly, in a way, like we'd just spooked ourselves out with a kid's game. But that didn't explain what happened next. Josh stood up to turn on the lights, but nothing happened. He flicked the switch a few more times, but the room stayed dark. I pulled out my phone to use the flashlight, only to realize it wasn't working either. No service, no Wi-Fi. Just that little no connection icon at the top of the screen. Emily tried her phone, then Sarah. Nothing. Every device was dead. "What is this?" Sarah whispered, her voice barely a murmur. We all tried to laugh it off, making jokes about power outages and dead zones, but the tension was thick. Something felt wrong, like we'd somehow crossed a line. Josh, ever the practical one, suggested we check the breaker box in the basement, thinking maybe we'd just blown a fuse. We stumbled around in the dark, using the faint glow from an old emergency flashlight Josh dug out of a drawer. I kept telling myself it was all just a coincidence. A creepy coincidence, sure, but nothing more. But as we descended the narrow, creaky staircase to the basement, I couldn't shake this growing feeling of dread. The basement was cold and smelled like mildew, and every step echoed in the stillness. Josh reached the breaker box and opened it, inspecting each switch one by one. "Everything looks fine," he muttered, flipping the switches back and forth. We were about to head back upstairs when we heard it, a faint, shuffling noise, like footsteps just beyond the reach of the flashlight's beam. We froze, listening, but the sound stopped as quickly as it had started. "Probably just rats," Josh whispered, though his face said he wasn't convinced. But as we turned to go back up, the basement door slammed shut with a force that shook the whole staircase. We all froze, staring up at the basement door, the sound of it slamming still echoing in my ears. Josh held the flashlight, its faint, jittery beam bouncing as his hand shook. We looked at each other, but no one said anything. There was nothing to say that would make sense of it. We were the only people in the house, and the windows had been closed the whole time. There was no draft, no breeze. So what, or who, had shut that door? Josh took a deep breath and muttered, "Okay, this is getting weird," as he climbed the steps, determined to brush it off. He grabbed the doorknob, gave it a quick twist, and then froze, his shoulders tensing. "It's locked." He jiggled the knob, harder this time, but it didn't budge. Sarah let out a nervous laugh. "Okay, very funny, guys. Who's playing around?" We all shook our heads. None of us had done it, and besides, there was no lock on the door from the basement side. We were just stuck. Josh banged on the door a couple of times, his voice edging into panic. "Come on, is anybody up there?" His voice echoed into silence. The flashlight flickered, casting long shadows against the basement walls. The four of us just stood there, surrounded by piles of forgotten boxes and furniture draped in dust-covered sheets. The place had that damp, earthy smell, like it hadn't been disturbed in years. It was like stepping back in time. I kept glancing at those dark corners, half expecting something, or someone, to step forward. Emily broke the silence. "Look, there's got to be another way out," she whispered, barely loud enough to hear. She pointed to a small, grimy window on the far wall, the kind you'd have to crawl through, probably just big enough for one of us to squeeze through. We all nodded, and Josh moved toward it, shining his flashlight over the dirty glass. He tried to open it, but it was stuck, the frame swollen and warped with age. He grunted, giving it a few hard pushes, but it didn't move. "That's it," Sarah whispered, her voice shaking. "We're trapped." The silence was deafening. I felt the weight of the room pressing down, like something was watching us, waiting. I kept telling myself that we were overreacting, that there had to be a logical explanation, but every instinct screamed that something was wrong. The temperature in the basement seemed to drop, and I could see my breath misting in front of me. Sarah shivered, rubbing her arms. "Is it just me, or did it just get freezing in here?" No one answered. We all felt it, this bone-deep chill that had nothing to do with the weather. I could see the hairs on my arms standing up, my hands clammy and cold. And then we heard it, the faintest whisper, barely audible but unmistakable. It echoed softly, like a voice from somewhere far away, coming closer. At first, I couldn't make out what it was saying, just the rhythm of it, slow and deliberate. The flashlight flickered again, casting strange, shifting shadows around the room. The whisper grew louder, forming words that sent a chill down my spine. "Why didn't you listen?" Emily's face went pale. What was that?" she stammered, her voice barely a whisper. None of us could answer. The words echoed around us, wrapping the room in an eerie silence after each whisper, like the house itself was listening, waiting for our response. Sarah grabbed my arm, her fingers digging in as if she could pull me back into reality. "Tell me you heard that too," she whispered, her eyes wide with fear. I nodded, feeling the same icy dread. We all heard it. Josh tried to stay calm, but I could see the panic building in his eyes. "All right, maybe it's just old pipes. Or the wind. We're all freaking ourselves out over nothing." He was trying to be brave, trying to keep us grounded, but the fear was clear in his voice. I don't know if he was trying to convince us or himself. We heard the whisper again, closer this time. The words came slow, deliberate, like they were being forced through something thick and heavy. "You didn't say goodbye." I felt a jolt of terror, the kind that goes straight to your bones. The last thing any of us wanted to think about was that we'd broken some rule with the Ouija board. But the voice was relentless, filling the silence with a cold, unfeeling accusation. Josh clenched his fists, glancing around as if he could find some invisible speaker hiding in the shadows. "All right, this is insane. We're getting out of here." He pounded on the door again, slamming his shoulder against it with all his weight, but the door wouldn't give. I could feel the panic spreading, each of us trapped in this small, freezing room, surrounded by whispers that felt more and more real with every passing second. The darkness seemed to press in closer, like it was watching, waiting. Then Emily's phone chimed, startling us all. She pulled it out, her face lighting up with hope as she saw a new message. But as she read it, her face went white. She held out her phone, her hand trembling. The message was from an unknown number, and it simply read, "You cannot leave until it is finished." We all stared at the screen, each of us more confused and terrified than the last. Emily looked up, her eyes wide. How would they know? It was a question none of us could answer, and I could see the fear setting in, raw and unfiltered. No one had our number. No one even knew we were in the basement, yet somehow, some way, this thing did. Josh cursed under his breath, pacing back and forth, running his hands through his hair like he was trying to shake off a nightmare. "This isn't happening. This can't be happening." Sarah looked up at him, her eyes filling with tears. "But it is," she whispered, "and I don't think it's going to let us go." The room felt like it was getting smaller, like the walls were pressing in on us. That icy chill sank deeper, a damp, creeping cold that settled into my bones. We all huddled together in the center of the room, trying to figure out what to do. Every instinct screamed that we needed to leave, but the house had other plans. "Okay, everyone, just stay calm," Josh muttered, his voice cracking. He was pacing again, casting nervous glances at the basement door, as if somehow he could will it open. But the thing is, the door wasn't just locked, it felt sealed, like some unseen force was holding it shut. Emily broke the silence, her voice barely above a whisper. What if this is because of the Ouija board?" We all looked at her. No one wanted to admit it, but that thought had been lurking in each of our minds. Sarah shook her head, laughing nervously, though there was nothing funny about it. "No way! It was just a board game. A stupid board game." But Emily's face was pale. "You heard what it said about saying goodbye. Maybe we didn't close it right. Maybe it's not done with us." A shiver ran through me, and for a moment, the memory of the board's final message, "Stay," replayed in my head. We'd laughed it off, hadn't taken it seriously. But now it was as if the house was holding us to it. Josh rubbed his temples, thinking hard. "All right, let's just get back to the board. Maybe we missed something. Maybe if we try again, I don't know. Let us go." He looked like he didn't believe his own words, but none of us had a better idea. Reluctantly, we walked back up the stairs, the creaks beneath our feet loud and ominous in the dead silence. The board was still there on the coffee table, looking as innocent as ever, with the planchette lying in the center, exactly where we'd left it. But now, it felt wrong. There was something sinister about it, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. We sat around it, the air heavy with tension. Emily was the first to place her fingers on the planchette, then the rest of us followed, our hands trembling. "All right," Josh said, his voice barely a whisper. "Let's just try this one more time. Maybe it'll give us a way out." He cleared his throat and began in a voice that tried and failed to be steady. Is there something you want from us?" For a moment, nothing happened. We all held our breath, waiting. Then, slowly, the planchette began to move. It slid across the board, the sound of it scraping against the wood echoing in the silence. Our hands shook as it spelled out each letter, one by one. Y-O-U. A chill ran down my spine. We all looked at each other, trying to process the message. "What does that mean?" Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. Josh shook his head, swallowing hard. I don't know, okay?" The planchette moved again, faster this time, as if it were growing impatient. It spelled out two more words, clear and unmistakable. L-I-F-E-D-E-B-T. "Life debt," Emily whispered, her face pale. What does that even mean?" But deep down, I think we all knew. We'd played around with something we didn't understand, and now it wanted something in return. The room seemed to grow darker, the shadows creeping in closer. I could feel the weight of something unseen pressing down on us, watching, waiting. Desperation took over. "What do you want us to do?" I asked, my voice trembling. The planchette slid across the board, stopping at each letter in quick succession, spelling out a new message. S-T-A-Y-O-R-P-A-Y. A hollow silence filled the room. We stared at each other, horror dawning in our eyes as we realized what it was saying. It wasn't going to let us leave. Not unless we gave it something in return. "We have to end this," Josh said, his voice shaking. "Maybe if we say goodbye properly this time, it'll let us go." We all nodded, not daring to hope, but clinging to the possibility that maybe, just maybe, there was a way out of this. We moved the planchette to goodbye, holding our breath as we waited for something, some sign that it was over. But nothing happened. And then, one by one, The lights around the room flickered and went out, plunging us into total darkness. The only light came from Josh's dim flashlight, which was starting to die, casting eerie shadows across our faces. "Okay, this isn't funny anymore," Sarah stammered, gripping my arm so tightly it hurt. "We need to get out of here." Before any of us could respond, we heard it again, the whispering. But this time, it wasn't coming from the board. It was all around us, filling the air, surrounding us in a wall of sound. It was like hundreds of voices, each one blending into the next, overlapping and repeating, the same words over and over. "Stay with us. Stay with us. Stay with us." The whispers grew louder, more insistent, filling my ears until it felt like they were burrowing into my mind. I clapped my hands over my ears, trying to block them out, but it was no use. They were inside my head, wrapping around my thoughts, tugging at my memories. And then I felt it. A hand, cold and bony, gripping my shoulder. I gasped, spinning around, but there was no one there. Just darkness and the faint outline of my friends, all looking just as terrified as I felt. Did anyone else feel that?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. Josh nodded, his face pale. I felt it too. Like someone was right there. The flashlight flickered again, and in that split second, I saw something. Just a brief flash, but enough to send my heart racing. A figure standing in the corner, shrouded in shadow. It was tall, unnaturally thin, its limbs stretched out like it didn't quite fit into the space it was occupying. And its eyes. I couldn't see them, not clearly, but I could feel them watching us, hungry and unblinking. And then it was gone, swallowed up by the darkness. "Did you guys see that?" Emily whispered, her voice barely audible. We all nodded, too afraid to speak, too afraid to breathe. Whatever this thing was, it was real, and it wasn't going to let us go. We were trapped, locked in this house with something that wanted us to stay forever. The darkness felt alive, like it was wrapping itself around us, seeping into every inch of the room. The whispers had stopped, but the silence that followed was even worse, thick and heavy, pressing down on us like a weight. None of us dared to move. We were too afraid that even the smallest motion would draw its attention again. Whatever it was still here, watching. Josh took a shaky breath, his eyes darting to the corners of the room where the shadows clung thickest. "We have to try the door again," he whispered. "We can't just stay here and wait for whatever that is to come back." I didn't argue. Every instinct I had screamed to get out of that house, no matter what it took. So, we gathered what courage we could, gripping each other's hands like our lives depended on it, and made our way up the stairs as quietly as we could. The steps creaked underfoot, each sound amplified in the dead silence, and with every creak, I felt that suffocating feeling grow stronger, like something was breathing down my neck. When we reached the top, Josh tried the door, jiggling the handle, his face twisted with concentration. He pulled, pushed, even threw his shoulder against it, but it wouldn't budge. It was like the door wasn't just locked, it was sealed, as if something on the other side was holding it shut. Frustration bubbled up in his voice. "It's not just the lock. There's something keeping us here." Emily's voice was barely more than a whisper, her face pale. "This house, it doesn't want us to leave." Sarah bit her lip, her face twisted with fear and disbelief. "But that's insane. Houses don't trap people. Spirits, or whatever this is, they can't trap us, right?" But deep down, none of us believed that anymore. We'd seen enough, felt enough. There was something here, something that wanted us, and it wasn't going to let us go. Just then, we heard it again, a faint scratching sound, like nails dragging slowly against wood. It was coming from the other side of the door, rhythmic and deliberate, like it wanted us to know it was there. My stomach twisted as I realized it was drawing closer, each scratch growing louder, more insistent. Josh stepped back, his face pale. "All right. If we can't go out the way we came, we need to find another way. Windows. Anything." We hurried down the hallway, searching each room, but every window was stuck, the frames swollen and warped, as if they'd been there for centuries without ever being opened. We tried forcing them, even throwing a chair against one, but the glass didn't so much as crack. It was as if the house itself was holding everything in place, trapping us inside. We gathered in the hallway, all of us out of breath, our minds racing. The scratching had stopped, replaced by an eerie silence that felt even more menacing. Sarah leaned against the wall, her hands shaking. "I don't know what to do. I don't think we're supposed to get out." Her words sent a chill through me. I glanced at Josh, hoping he'd have some kind of answer, but his face was blank, lost in thought. He looked like he was fighting to keep his composure, but I could see the fear in his eyes. And then, from somewhere deep within the house, we heard it. A slow, deliberate knocking coming from the far end of the hall. It echoed through the walls, each knock heavy and precise, as if counting down to something. Knock, knock, knock. Emily backed up, her face pale as she glanced over her shoulder. "It's coming from the attic." We all turned to face the narrow staircase leading up to that dark, cramped space above us. The air felt colder, heavier, like we were standing at the edge of something terrible. None of us wanted to go up there, but at the same time, we couldn't ignore it. The knocks grew louder, more insistent, vibrating through the walls, as if whatever was in the attic was demanding our attention. Josh's face was set, grim. "If we don't check it out, if we keep running, I don't think it'll ever stop. Maybe there's something up there that will explain all of this." I didn't like it. None of us did. But in the back of my mind, I knew he was right. This thing had cornered us, and now it wanted us to come to it. We didn't have a choice. So, one by one, we climbed the creaky stairs, each step feeling like it was taking us deeper into a nightmare. The attic was pitch black, filled with old furniture and forgotten boxes, covered in a thick layer of dust. Josh aimed the flashlight around, illuminating the twisted shapes of things that hadn't been touched in years. But it wasn't the furniture or the boxes that made my skin crawl. It was the feeling that something was waiting for us, hidden in the shadows, watching our every move. And then, in the corner of the room, we saw it. There was a small, dusty mirror propped against the wall, its surface warped and speckled with age. But in the dim light, I could see something moving inside it, a figure, shifting and twisting, its outline barely visible. It was dark and skeletal, with eyes that glowed faintly, watching us with a hunger that made my stomach twist. "Do you see that?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. We all nodded, unable to look away. The figure in the mirror leaned forward, its eyes locked onto us. And then it spoke. Its voice was low, rasping, like it was scraping through layers of dust and decay. "You're here because you invited me, and now you're part of this house." I felt a chill run down my spine. Part of this house. The words echoed in my mind, filling me with a cold, nauseating dread. It was as if this thing had been waiting for us, for someone to stumble upon it and set it free. Josh took a step back, his face white with terror. What do you mean?" The figure's eyes gleamed, and it leaned closer to the surface of the mirror, its face twisted into a mocking smile. "You opened the door, and now you're mine. You'll stay here. Forever." The room seemed to close in around us, the shadows growing thicker, darker, pressing in from all sides. We stumbled back, tripping over old boxes, clawing at the door, desperate to escape. But no matter how hard we tried, the darkness kept pulling us back, wrapping around us like a shroud. The last thing I remember before everything went black was the sound of that horrible, rasping laughter, filling the room, echoing through the walls, as if the house itself was laughing, savouring our fear. and then silence. When I opened my eyes, I was lying on the floor in complete darkness. My head throbbed, my body felt heavy, and the air was thick with dust and that damp, earthy smell of decay. For a few seconds, I thought I was alone, until I heard soft breathing nearby. "Guys?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. "Here," came a faint response. It was Josh. I reached out, my hand brushing against something warm and solid. He grabbed my hand tightly and I could feel him trembling. Gradually, I became aware of Sarah and Emily nearby, huddled together in the shadows. No one spoke. We just sat there, listening, waiting. The house was silent now, the oppressive weight of it pressing down on us, as if the very walls were leaning in, watching us, waiting for us to move. Finally, Josh's voice broke the silence. We need to get out of here, now." But something in his voice told me he didn't believe we could. And deep down, I didn't believe it either. Whatever had happened in the attic, whatever we'd seen in that mirror, had changed something. It was like the house had swallowed us whole, like we were part of it now. We stumbled down the stairs, using our phones as dim flashlights, though they barely pierced the darkness. The familiar rooms we'd spent hours in just felt wrong. The walls seemed to twist and shift in the faint light, making the hallways feel endless and maze-like, leading us in circles as we tried to find our way out. At one point, we thought we'd reached the front door. I could see it right there, just a few feet away. But when we ran toward it, the hallway seemed to stretch, pulling the door further and further from reach, until we were left standing in the middle of the dark, empty corridor, with no idea where we were. We're trapped," Emily whispered, her voice barely holding back a sob. The floorboards creaked, as if something heavy was moving just above us, following our every step. We could hear faint footsteps pacing, echoing from every corner surrounding us. It felt like the house was alive, like it was breathing us in, piece by piece. Just then, Sarah's phone buzzed, its screen lighting up with a notification. She stared at it, her face drained of colour. It's from that same unknown number," she stammered, holding the phone so we could see. The message read, "You didn't say goodbye. The debt remains." The words were chillingly clear, more than just a warning. They were a sentence, a binding promise from whatever force had claimed us. We looked at each other, the horror settling in. The house wouldn't let us go because we hadn't paid the price. Josh stepped back, his face twisted with terror. So what do we do? How do we pay this debt?" As if in response, a door at the end of the hall creaked open, revealing a narrow staircase leading downward into an even deeper, darker part of the house. None of us had noticed it before, and it hadn't been there when we'd explored the place earlier. It was clear what it wanted. Something lay at the bottom of those stairs, something waiting for us, and whatever it was, it held the answer we needed, or our fate. We had no choice. Slowly, with each of us holding onto each other, we descended the staircase, the creaking steps echoing with each step, the air growing colder, thicker, with a dampness that made it hard to breathe. At the bottom, we found ourselves in a cramped, low-ceilinged room lit only by a single flickering bulb. In the centre of the room, there was a small table, and on it lay the Ouija board, waiting for us like it had been expecting us all along. The planchette was already positioned in the centre, resting on the faded letters, and as we stepped closer, it trembled, as if in anticipation. Josh took a deep breath and placed his fingers on it. One by one, the rest of us did the same, our hands shaking as we made contact with the cold wood. The second we all touched it, the planchette began to move, jerking across the board with a force that felt almost alive. It spelled out a single word, each letter slow and deliberate, P-A-Y. Emily swallowed hard, her voice a faint whisper. How? What does it want from us? The planchette moved again, this time faster, almost eagerly. Yoursuls. We all pulled back, horror etched on our faces. We'd heard stories, rumors of deals with the supernatural, but none of us had ever thought we'd actually be bargaining with our lives. Josh clenched his fists, his face set with determination. No. No way. There has to be another way. We're not just giving in to this. But as if it could hear his defiance, the house seemed to tremble around us, the walls creaking, the floorboards groaning under our feet. The lights flickered, plunging us into darkness for a heartbeat before returning, dimmer than before. Then, one by one, our phones began to chime. Each of us received a message from that same unknown number, the words identical. You're already part of this house. You can never leave. The messages kept coming, each new notification filling the room with an unrelenting, hollow chime, over and over, until they blended into a single, mocking rhythm. We couldn't turn the phones off, couldn't silence them, and the sound filled every corner, making it impossible to think. Finally, the noise stopped, leaving only the heavy, suffocating silence. And then, with a sense of dread, I looked back at the Ouija board. The planchette moved again, slowly spelling out one last message. You didn't say goodbye. The words sent a chill through me. This whole time, we'd been trying to escape, trying to fight it. But the board, the house, whatever this thing was, it wasn't giving us a choice. It was reminding us of the one rule we'd broken, the one thing we'd failed to do. I took a shaky breath, steeling myself. We have to finish this, properly this time. Slowly, we all placed our fingers back on the planchette, guiding it to the word goodbye. As soon as we did, a strange calm settled over the room, the shadows receding, the air growing lighter, as if the house was finally satisfied. The silence that followed was absolute, and for a moment, I thought it was over. But then, I felt it, a cold touch on my shoulder, like icy fingers trailing down my spine. A voice, low and rasping, echoed in my ear, a final whisper that sent a chill through my bones. We'll be waiting. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the lights came back on. The house felt normal, like any other old, creaky home. The air was warm again, the shadows no longer clinging to the corners. We stumbled out, barely daring to believe it, our minds reeling, our hearts still racing. We didn't talk much as we left, too shaken to make sense of what had happened. But as we stepped outside, each of us felt it, the weight of that house still lingering, like a shadow we couldn't shake. We never went back, and no matter how many times I move, or how far I go, I'll always feel it, just a faint, familiar chill, like a pair of eyes watching from somewhere far away, waiting, patient and unyielding. And every time I hear a creak in the night, or feel the cold air settle over me, I can still hear that whisper, we'll be waiting. The Ouija board told me to stop asking questions, but now it's asking me questions instead. So, I'll admit it, I wasn't exactly looking for trouble, but I guess I found it anyway. It all started a couple of weeks back when I stumbled across this story online about a guy who supposedly found answers to his darkest secrets using a Ouija board. I've always had this weird fascination with the unknown, and the deep web's been a curiosity of mine for years, though I never dabbled too deep. Just enough to say I'd checked it out, you know. Anyway, I read this story, and it got stuck in my head. The thought of using a Ouija board to talk to whatever might be on the other side. Creepy, but a little intriguing. Besides, how seriously do you take something like that, right? So, I bought one online and decided I'd try it out. It was one of those cheap, mass-produced boards, but I figured it would do the trick for my little experiment. And to be honest, I didn't expect anything to happen. I live alone, so one quiet Saturday night, I set up the board on my living room floor. I lit a couple of candles, dimmed the lights for effect, and sat down, feeling a bit ridiculous. The air was stale, and I could swear I heard my neighbour's TV faintly humming through the wall. Good old reality check. I hovered my fingers over the planchette and whispered the first question that came to mind. Is anyone here? Nothing. I wasn't surprised. I kind of chuckled to myself, feeling silly for even trying. I was just about to put the board away and call it a night when, out of nowhere, my laptop screen blinked to life. Now, I keep my laptop on the coffee table next to the board, and it was off. Completely off. No power light. Nothing. But here it was, screen shining bright in the dark room. I leaned over, not quite sure what I was expecting to see. And that's when I noticed something strange. My cursor was moving, by itself. Not slowly or randomly, like a glitch or a loose mouse, but with purpose, like someone was controlling it. It started typing in the search bar. Are you there? My heart started racing. I laughed it off at first, chalking it up to some freaky bug. But the cursor didn't stop. It moved down, hovering over the Ouija board where it had typed, and clicked enter. The search results were weird. It wasn't anything typical you'd find online, more like a chat window or a forum thread. There were no usernames, just a bunch of strange symbols and numbers that looked like a code. And under that, in plain text, were the words, "Why are you here?" All right. Now I was spooked. I glanced around the room like an idiot, half expecting someone to jump out of the shadows and yell, "Gotcha!" But I was alone, just me, my laptop, and the Ouija board, and the search bar, blinking at me, as if waiting for an answer. I didn't know what else to do, so I played along. I moved my fingers over the laptop keyboard, typed back. I was just curious. I hit enter and waited, my stomach doing flips. The response came almost instantly. "Stop asking questions." I laughed nervously, telling myself it was just some hacker messing around with me. But deep down, something didn't feel right. There was this heaviness in the room, like when you're about to walk into a room where something bad happened. The air felt thicker, colder. I shrugged it off and typed back, "Why?" I'm telling you, the moment I hit enter, everything went pitch black. I'm talking complete blackout. My laptop shut down and the lights went out, leaving me sitting in the dark with nothing but the faint glow of the candles. And just when I thought things couldn't get weirder, I heard this faint tapping sound. It was coming from my laptop screen. When the power kicked back on, I jumped out of my skin. My laptop was glowing again, but this time there was something new on the screen. It was different, like it was just pixels shifting back and forth. But then I saw it, a figure. I couldn't make it out clearly, but it looked like someone hunched over, staring straight at me. My hands shook as I reached for the laptop to close it, but the second my fingers touched it, the screen flickered and I saw text. Just one sentence, but it was enough to send chills down my spine. "I told you to stop asking questions." I yanked my hands away like I'd touched a hot stove. I wanted to shut the whole thing down, get out of there, and forget about this stupid idea. But I was frozen, glued to my spot. The room felt alive, like it was watching me, waiting to see what I'd do next. Then the screen glitched again, showing a single word in the search bar. "Why?" That's when I realized, whatever I was talking to, it had flipped the script on me. The board wasn't the only one asking questions anymore. It wanted answers. The silence in my apartment was unbearable. Every little creak or shuffle sounded like a thunderclap, like the walls themselves were alive, breathing in sync with my panicked breaths. I didn't dare touch my laptop again, but I couldn't look away from the screen either. That single word, "Why?" seemed to pulse, fading in and out, almost like it was taunting me. I'm not sure what I was thinking, but instead of shutting the laptop or smashing it like every part of me wanted to, I found myself grabbing a pen and notebook from the coffee table. If whatever was on the other end wanted answers, maybe writing them down would somehow satisfy it? Or maybe I just lost my mind. My first answer was simple. I don't know. The second I finished writing it, my laptop chimed. It wasn't a normal chime, though. It was distorted, like someone was playing a piano note underwater. The screen flickered, and new text appeared. "Yes, you do." I froze, the hairs on the back of my neck standing straight up. I wanted to tell myself it was just a coincidence, but every part of me knew better. The question it had asked was lingering in my head, nagging at me like it was trying to pull something out of my memory. I scribbled the words down on the notebook, trying to make sense of everything. It wasn't until I looked back up at the screen that I realized the figure was still there, clearer now, almost like it was leaning in closer. The silhouette was sharper, more defined, though the face was still a shadow. But the eyes, those I could see, they weren't fully formed, more like two glowing slits that cut through the darkness, staring right at me. I felt this strange pull, like the longer I looked at it, the deeper it could reach into my mind, and whatever was hiding in there, it knew. I don't know how long I sat there, staring at the screen, but eventually, my fingers found their way back to the keyboard. I started typing, my thoughts spilling out in a jumble. "I don't know what you want from me. I don't even know who you are." The response came quickly, the same distorted chime ringing out, somehow even louder than before. "Yes, you do. Think back." And just like that, a flood of images filled my mind, memories I hadn't thought about in years. The late-night surfing forums that went deeper than the standard internet, the sketchy sites where anonymous users would share files and secrets. There was one specific night that I hadn't thought about in forever. Back when I was still in high school, I'd stumbled on a site claiming to have answers to anything you wanted to know, all for a price. Of course, back then it seemed like a joke, but what I saw there, what I asked back then. The laptop chimed again, pulling me back to the present. "You asked for something once, didn't you?" A knot formed in my stomach. I could feel the memories clawing their way back. My younger self, dumb and curious, sitting in my room late at night, typing questions into a website that promised secrets in return for your trust. My question had been simple enough, though stupid now that I thought about it. Will I ever know the truth? And whoever or whatever was on the other end had given me a strange reply. "Someday you'll wish you hadn't asked." I'd laughed it off as a hoax, an internet prank, but deep down, the answer had haunted me for years. The figure on the screen shifted, leaning closer until it filled the entire screen, almost like it was pressing its face against the other side, trying to push through. The distorted voice came through my laptop speakers now, a low, gravelly sound that crackled with static. "You're ready to know now, aren't you?" I didn't answer, but my hands were trembling. I felt my heart pounding in my chest like it was trying to burst out. I wanted to run, to throw the laptop out the window and never look back. But something was holding me there. The air felt charged, like the entire room was crackling with invisible energy. And then, as if sensing my hesitation, the figure's voice turned softer, almost coaxing. "Come on, don't you want to see what you were too scared to look for?" I don't know what came over me, but I felt my fingers moving again, typing almost as if they had a mind of their own. "Yes," I replied, watching the word appear on the screen, feeling that same knot in my stomach tighten with dread. The response didn't come in words this time. The screen glitched, and for a second, I could see something else behind the figure, a room that looked strikingly familiar. It was dark and cluttered, the walls lined with posters and shelves stacked with books and trinkets. And that's when it hit me. It was my old room, the one from high school. The exact room where I'd asked my first question all those years ago. I felt the blood drain from my face as I stared at the screen. This wasn't just some hacker. This was someone, or something, that knew me. Knew my past. Knew things I'd tried to forget. The voice came through the speakers one more time, louder this time, almost like it was right in my ear. "Do you remember now?" I didn't know what to say. But before I could answer, the screen cut to black. My reflection stared back at me in the dim light, pale and wide-eyed. For a split second, I thought I saw the figure's eyes over my shoulder in the reflection. 2 faint slits glowing just behind me. The lights flickered, and the air grew heavy again, almost suffocating. I felt my pulse quicken as I waited, listening to the silence, expecting something to happen, but it didn't. Instead, the laptop screen blinked to life again. A new line of text appeared, simple and chilling. "You started this, now finish it." I felt like I was on the edge of something I couldn't come back from, teetering over a cliff I'd accidentally wandered too close to. But whatever was pulling me, whatever was controlling my fingers, wouldn't let me stop now, and part of me, deep down, knew that it wasn't going to let me go until I saw this through. There was one last question on the screen now, bold and ominous, waiting for me to answer. "Are you ready for the truth?" I could feel my own breath, shallow and cold. But as much as I wanted to shut the laptop, run, or do anything to escape, I knew there was no turning back. The only thing I could do now was type "yes" and brace myself for whatever came next. The second I hit "yes," my laptop screen flickered again, and a new message appeared almost instantly, like it had been waiting for me to give in. The words were short, simple, but they hit me harder than anything else so far. "Look behind you." I couldn't move. My entire body felt locked in place, as if some invisible force was holding me down. The shadows in the room felt thicker, pressing in around me, and every instinct screamed at me to turn around, to see if something, or someone, was standing there. But I just couldn't. My hands were shaking, but I forced myself to look at the screen instead, focusing on the faint glow, as if that alone could protect me. I typed back with trembling fingers. "Why?" The response popped up almost instantly. "Because you need to remember." The room felt colder now, almost icy. I could see my own breath fogging up in the glow of the laptop screen. And somewhere, faintly, I could hear a sound, a soft, scratching noise, like something sharp dragging along a rough surface. My heart raced faster, every beat thudding in my chest like a drum, loud enough to drown out the noise. And then the sound stopped. I held my breath, waiting, listening to the silence. Then, slowly, painfully, I forced myself to look over my shoulder. There was nothing there, just the empty room, dimly lit by the glow from my laptop. But as my gaze swept the walls, I noticed something strange. My apartment was bare. I didn't hang anything on the walls. Yet, in the faint light, I could see markings scratched into the paint, stretching from the floor all the way up to the ceiling. They weren't random either. They were words. Why did you ask? The words were scrawled over and over, carved deep into the walls like they'd been scratched in with something sharp, maybe even claws, and they weren't there just for me to see. It was like they were there for anyone who dared to look, a silent warning echoing through the empty space around me. I stumbled back, heart pounding, and turned to look back at the laptop. A new message was waiting for me. "Do you remember now?" My hands felt numb as I typed my reply. What am I supposed to remember? The screen blinked, and then the figure was back, clearer this time. It felt like it was only inches away, pressing right up against the screen. I could see its face now, gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to sink into its skull, and a twisted, almost mocking smile. The longer I stared at it, the more it felt like I was looking into a warped, distorted version of my own face. And then it spoke, not through text, but through the speakers, a harsh, guttural voice that sent chills down my spine. "You came looking for me once. Don't you remember?" The voice echoed in my ears, pulling at memories I'd buried deep down. I was flooded with images of that night years ago. The dim glow of my old laptop, the quiet hum of my parents sleeping down the hall as I typed out question after question. I didn't remember everything I'd asked back then, but one thing was clear. I'd been desperate for answers, hungry for something beyond the mundane. The screen flickered and new words appeared. You didn't just ask questions, you made a promise. A promise? My mind spun, reaching back, trying to pull at the foggy edges of that memory. And then it hit me. That night, I hadn't just been asking questions. I'd asked for something specific, something I'd been too embarrassed or maybe too scared to admit. I'd wanted to see what lay beyond the veil, to understand things that no one else could, and I'd typed out a message, a challenge, to whatever was on the other side. Show me the truth, and I'll never ask again. I'd thought it was a joke, a prank, something to get a rise out of whatever was on the other end. But now, staring at those words on the screen, it felt like a promise I'd never kept. The figure's voice echoed again, low and menacing. You wanted to see the truth. Now, it's your turn to keep your word. I felt my stomach drop. I tried to type back, to explain that I hadn't meant it, that it had been a stupid, thoughtless thing I'd done years ago. But my fingers wouldn't move. It was like they were stuck, frozen to the keys, held down by some unseen force. The screen flickered, the figure's face looming closer, until it filled the entire screen, its hollow eyes boring into mine. Then, without warning, the screen went black again. For a moment, I thought maybe the whole thing was over. Maybe it had been a nightmare or some glitch my mind had blown out of proportion. But before I could breathe a sigh of relief, the screen came back to life, revealing something new. It was a live video feed, and it was showing my apartment. I was looking at myself, sitting there, staring at the screen. I felt my heart hammer in my chest as I watched my own terrified reflection staring back at me, every detail perfectly mirrored on the screen. But then, slowly, the camera angle started to shift, panning around the room, revealing every corner, every shadowed edge of the walls behind me. And that's when I saw it. In the far corner of the room, just outside the glow of the laptop, was a shape. Small, hunched, like a figure crouched low to the ground, hidden in the shadows. It was watching me, waiting, its eyes glinting faintly in the dark. My stomach twisted as I realized the figure in the feed wasn't a glitch or some strange digital artifact. It was real, a physical presence, right there, in the room with me. The figure on the screen leaned closer, a twisted smile spreading across its face. "You asked for the truth," it whispered, its voice crackling through the speakers. "And now it's here." I bolted up from my seat, backing away from the laptop, my mind spinning, every instinct screaming at me to get out of the apartment. But as I reached the door, something stopped me. A single word, etched into the wood in those same jagged, clawed lines. Stay. I was trapped. The words, the figure, the memories. It all felt like it was closing in around me, drawing me into some twisted nightmare I couldn't escape. I was breathing hard, my back pressed against the door, my eyes darting between the screen and the shadows in the room. The figure on the screen leaned forward again, its eyes glinting with a strange, dark hunger. "You wanted answers," it said, its voice a low, mocking hiss. "So here they are. You can't run from the truth. Not anymore." And then the lights flickered, and the entire room plunged into darkness. The darkness was absolute. My heart hammered in my chest, every beat echoing in the silence. I fumbled for my phone in my pocket, desperate to turn on the flashlight, but it felt like my hands were moving through water. The air was thick, heavy, like it was pressing down on me, squeezing the breath from my lungs. And then I heard it, a soft, scraping sound coming from the corner of the room, the same corner where the figure had been on the video feed. It was subtle at first, like nails dragging along the floor, but then it grew louder, sharper, each scratch reverberating through the room. I wanted to believe it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but deep down, I knew. Something was in there with me. My fingers finally found the flashlight on my phone, and I flicked it on, aiming the beam toward the corner. The light cut through the darkness, revealing nothing. Just empty space, the bare walls, and the faint marks scratched into the paint, like the words were watching me, waiting. I took a step back, my eyes darting around, trying to make sense of what was happening, and then my phone vibrated, jolting me so hard, I nearly dropped it. I looked down, and there it was, a notification, a text message from an unknown number. My stomach tightened as I opened it. You can't hide from this. The text was followed by a link, one of those random strings of letters and numbers that didn't make any sense. I hesitated, every instinct screaming at me to ignore it, to shut my phone off and get out of there. But part of me, the same part that had started this whole mess, felt the pull to know more. With a shaky hand, I tapped the link, and it opened a video. The screen was black at first, just faint static and a low hum, like the audio was picking up white noise. But then, slowly, an image started to fade in, another live feed. My apartment, exactly as it was, only this time, the angle was different. It wasn't from my laptop, it was from somewhere else, like a camera hidden behind the walls, watching me from a new angle. And that's when I saw it, the shadow, shifting, moving closer. It was right behind me. I spun around, but there was nothing there, just the empty room. My heart was racing, my mind spinning. I turned back to the phone, but the image on the screen had changed. It was closer now, the camera zooming in, almost like it was trying to focus on something. I could see myself standing there, wide-eyed, panicked, looking right into the lens. Then, a new message appeared on the video, scrawled across the screen in jagged white text. Look closer. The words faded, and the video zoomed in, slowly, until it was focused on my face. And then, as if the screen was coming alive, I saw it. Something dark and twisted. A figure barely visible, lurking just behind my reflection. It was so close, its face almost touching mine, and I could see its hollow, empty eyes staring back at me. My hands shook as I watched it. The image burned into my mind, too real to be a trick or glitch. I could feel it now, the presence in the room, pressing in around me, its breath cold against my skin, even though there was nothing there when I looked. I wanted to scream, to run, but my feet wouldn't move. I was frozen, trapped in place, as the figure's face twisted into a sickening grin. A voice crackled through the speakers on my phone, soft but unmistakable, like a whisper clawing its way through the static. You made a promise, now it's time to pay. The video shifted again, this time showing a familiar scene. My high school bedroom. It was like watching a ghost, a haunting glimpse of the past. I could see myself, younger, sitting at my old desk, my eyes glued to my laptop. I watched as I typed, my fingers moving quickly across the keyboard. The screen zoomed in, focusing on the text, showing my old messages, my questions, each one more desperate than the last. Show me what's out there, show me everything. The words felt like a punch to the gut. I'd been so naive back then, messing around with things I didn't understand, opening doors I couldn't close. I didn't think it was real. I didn't think there would be consequences. But now, standing here, staring at that memory, I knew I'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. The video cut to black, and then a new message flashed on the screen, each word sending a chill down my spine. You've seen the truth. Now there's no going back. The room seemed to close in around me, the walls pressing tighter, and I felt a strange, pulsing energy building, like something was about to break through. My phone screen flickered, and for a split second, I saw my own reflection staring back at me, only it wasn't me. The eyes were wrong, darker, hollowed out, and the mouth twisted into that same sick grin. And then, As if the reflection itself had come alive, it leaned forward and whispered, "Run." I didn't need to be told twice. I turned, bolting for the door, my heart pounding, the shadows stretching across the room, like fingers reaching out to drag me back. I grabbed the door handle, twisted, and threw it open, stumbling into the hallway. The air felt lighter, freer, but my skin crawled with the feeling that something was right behind me, following, reaching, desperate to pull me back. I ran down the stairs, not looking back, my footsteps echoing through the empty halls. I didn't stop until I was outside, breathing in the cool night air, my mind still reeling. I thought I was safe, thought maybe I'd escaped whatever had been haunting me, but then I felt it, a vibration in my pocket, my phone. With a deep breath, I pulled it out, my hands still shaking. There was a new message from the same unknown number. "You can't escape the truth." And then another message came through, as if it was taunting me, reminding me of the promise I'd made all those years ago. "Come back. It's waiting." I dropped the phone, watching it clatter to the ground, the screen still glowing with those words. I wanted to leave it there, to walk away and pretend none of this had happened. But deep down, I knew I couldn't run from it forever. The truth was out there, waiting for me. And somehow, I knew I'd have to face it, one way or another. I stumbled down the street, clutching my arms to my chest to steady myself. But I couldn't stop shivering. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see something lurking in the shadows, following me, that same hollow-eyed figure from my screen. I wanted to believe I could just walk away, that I could disappear from whatever this was. But I knew it wasn't that simple. It wouldn't let me go. I didn't know where I was going, just that I had to keep moving, had to keep putting distance between me and my apartment, between me and that promise I had stupidly made years ago. I rounded a corner and saw a small 24-hour diner up ahead, its lights flickering in the distance like a beacon in the night. It wasn't much, but it felt like some kind of refuge. The diner was empty, just me and the exhausted-looking waitress wiping down the counter. I found a booth in the corner, trying to calm myself down, my back to the wall so I could see the whole room. I could feel my phone in my pocket, burning like it was made of fire, but I didn't dare pull it out. It was too late for that. The messages would be there, waiting for me, and I wasn't ready to see them. The waitress brought me a coffee without me even ordering, just giving me a tired, sympathetic look, as if she'd seen worse than a guy stumbling in at 3 a.m., looking like he'd seen a ghost. I tried to sip the coffee, but my hands wouldn't stop shaking, and the warm liquid spilled down my chin. I set it down, staring into the dark surface, hoping for, I don't know, some kind of answer, some sign that this was just a nightmare I'd wake up from. Then, I felt it, a soft, buzzing vibration in my pocket. My heart sank. I could feel it, like a weight pressing down on me, the sense that this wasn't over, not by a long shot. Slowly, I pulled out my phone, its glow casting a faint light across the table. Sure enough, there was a new message from that same unknown number. "You can't hide." I looked around, my eyes scanning the empty diner, searching for something, anything that would prove I wasn't alone, that this was all just some elaborate prank. But there was nothing, just me, the quiet hum of the diner's neon lights, and that endless darkness outside the window. The phone buzzed again, and another message popped up. "Remember your promise." My stomach twisted as I read the words, each one sinking deeper, dragging me down. I typed back, my fingers clumsy, desperate. I didn't mean it. I was just a kid. I didn't know what I was doing. The response was instant, as if it had been waiting for me. "But you still asked, and you wanted to know." I stared at the screen, my mind racing. I had no idea what I could say to make this thing leave me alone. But then, a new message appeared, one that made my blood run cold. "We're not done yet. You've only seen part of the truth." The words seemed to pulse on the screen, like they were alive, breathing. I wanted to throw the phone across the room, to shatter it and walk away. But something held me there. I felt a strange pull, the same one that had brought me here in the first place, that had driven me to ask those questions all those years ago. I needed to know. I needed to finish this, once and for all. With a deep breath, I typed back, "Fine, show me." The screen went black, and for a moment I thought maybe it was over. But then the phone screen flickered to life again, showing another live feed. Only this time, it wasn't my apartment. It was the diner, my booth, me, staring down at my phone with wide, terrified eyes. The camera angle shifted, zooming in until I could see my own face, close up, every detail etched with fear and exhaustion. Then, slowly, the angle panned over my shoulder, focusing on something just out of view. My heart pounded, a sickening feeling rising in my gut as I realized what it was showing me. There, barely visible in the dark, was that same figure, hunched and twisted, standing just a few feet behind me. I whipped around, half expecting to see it standing there in the flesh, but the booth was empty, the diner silent except for the faint hum of the lights. I turned back to my phone, dread pooling in my stomach, as the screen continued to show the live feed, the figure growing closer, step by step, its face twisting into a grin. The figure's voice came through the speakers, soft but unmistakable, a whisper cutting through the silence. "You asked for the truth. Now it's yours." The screen flickered, and suddenly, I wasn't looking at the diner anymore. I was back in that room, the room from high school where I'd asked the first question, where I'd made that foolish, reckless promise. The figure loomed closer, its face coming into focus, and as I stared at it, I realized something that sent a chill down my spine. It was me, or rather, it was something that looked like me, a twisted, hollow version of myself, with the same face, the same eyes, but wrong. It was as if every dark thought, every hidden fear, every piece of myself I'd tried to bury had taken form, staring back at me with a mocking smile. And then, in a voice that was both mine and not mine, it spoke. "This is what you wanted. You've always wanted to know what lay beyond." I couldn't look away. The figure held me there, its eyes locking onto mine, pulling me deeper into the screen until it felt like I was sinking, like I was falling into some endless void, spiraling down with no way to escape. "And now," it whispered, "you'll never be alone again." The screen went dark, leaving me staring at my own reflection, my pale, horrified face staring back. I looked around the diner, half expecting to see shadows creeping closer, but everything was still, eerily silent. I tried to steady my breath, to remind myself that I was safe, that it was just a screen, just a trick. But then, as I glanced at my reflection, I saw something else, just a glimpse, just for a second, but it was enough. There in the reflection, standing right behind me, was that figure, its face twisted into a mocking smile, its hollow eyes staring into mine. And as the light flickered one last time, I heard its voice, soft, chilling, and unmistakable. "You can't escape the truth." The lights in the diner flickered out, plunging me into darkness.